This is a continuation of an interview with Ms. Nancy Spero, in which she describes bargaining tactics for financial and buyer-seller negotiations.
And a fifth tactic I've observed is the use of concessions. Now, this is a very broad topic, and I'd like to spend just a few minutes on it. In our culture, negotiating involves the use of concessions. As I said, the initial offer is often interpreted to mean that it's not the final offer and that people end up talking from there and working closer and closer together, eventually possibly making an agreement. Because of this use of concessions, one usually has to give oneself room to negotiate. And that means you have to start off with a very high level of aspiration. You have to push yourself at the very beginning. What is the most I can get out of this deal, and how can I justify it to the other person? By starting off with a very high aspiration, and by keeping that aspiration high throughout your concessions, you will end up resolving coming to agreement possibly a much higher result than if you hadn't kept in mind that your aspiration should be high. In the use of concessions, make the other side work for everything they get. That doesn't mean you have to be a tough son of a bitch or anything like that. But if you do give up something, I recommend that you get something in return. That will also raise the other person's aspirations and cause him to understand your concession style. You conserve your concessions. Don't give tremendous hunks of concessions all at one time. And it's very important to watch the pattern of your concessions. I recommend that you do it consistently. That at the initial part of your negotiation, you give reasonable size concessions and give them in decreasing sizes until you come to a point when you feel you want to make a deal or walk away. And you've communicated that non-verbally and without even gesture by your concession pattern. And if you understand this concession pattern conveys this impression, you might just plan out your concession pattern at the beginning to reach the goal that you want to reach and not find too late that you've conceded away too much. When someone proposes that you concede by splitting the difference 50-50, my answer to that is hogwash. The 50-50 concession is a bunch of junk. There's no reason to split anything 50-50 unless it makes sense. Now, sometimes it does make sense. On the other hand, if you have every reason to keep the agreement closer to your aspiration than to that 50% level, do so and tell the other side why. They'll respect you for it, and they might just come up to you. Another thing that I tell people to do and remember is don't be ashamed to walk away from a poorly made concession. A concession is not an agreement on a complete deal. And subject to your credibility and your track record as a negotiator, it's perfectly permissible to find that you've made an improper concession or that you wish to rethink a concession. But my recommendation to anybody who wishes to do this is to be concerned about your credibility. For example, if you feel you've made an improper concession and you want to retract it, certainly there's a way to justify it on a new event or a new element that has come up since you're at that concession.
Perhaps a surprise being placed on you by your opponent, for example.
That's right. Or it could be a third-party event, totally irrelevant to what's going on between you. For example, say that you have made a concession that you're going to purchase a certain product at 100,000 Deutsche Mark. All right? You haven't negotiated the complete deal yet. You haven't negotiated delivery or warranties or anything like that. The next day, the Deutsche Mark is devalued. You can certainly renegotiate and open up on that concession on the basis that the mark has been devalued, no longer has the same value to you, and you will have to renegotiate on that term.
But you're emphasizing the need to look for some type of justification when withdrawing a concession.
That's right. I would recommend that. Otherwise, it would appear that you're being arbitrary and untrustworthy, and certainly a good negotiator wants to avoid those kinds of impressions. It's very important to have a good track record as a negotiator. You are working with a lot of people, even though they may be on another side of a project. You need their cooperation, and in order to get somewhere, you have to satisfy both sides' needs. So I would recommend that you do so in a face-saving way if you can. And a sixth tactic I've observed is the use of time. Now, already in the discussion of our other tactics, we've touched upon it, but I'd like everybody to think about time as an independent tactic of negotiation, because the reading I've done on negotiation has indicated that time is probably the most powerful tactic in negotiation. It's power. The person who has time really holds all the cards, or holds most of the cards, let's put it that way, because deadlines force action. Let's put it this way. Let's say you're in a very poor negotiating posture. You don't have a lot of the resources or the money or the skill or the product that your other side has, but you have time. What's going on in the other side's process, trying to negotiate with you while you're analyzing and researching and talking to them and so forth? Well, they might be divided. There might be questioning going on within their organization. Is their negotiator doing a good job? Maybe they're getting tired. Maybe they want to come to an agreement. Maybe they're getting so exhausted by the whole process that they'll meet you much closer to your goal just to get the whole thing over with. Perhaps by talking to them over this amount of time that you're using, they'll give you more information that may be useful to you. Very rarely does time work against you if you can use it, and I recommend people to use it to their advantage.
How do you counter that tactic when it's being used against you?
If you have your own deadlines within your own system, try to renegotiate them within your own system. Again, time may be a boogie. If your superior tells you you have to negotiate a purchase contract by a certain date, and it looks like that deadline is really putting you into some tight boundaries, negotiate with your superior to get an extension on that. Just because negotiation is a word in business doesn't mean you use it outside your business. You also use it within, with people within your own organization. Perhaps that is a boogie. Perhaps he wanted it done by that date, but he could live with an extra day or two or even week. On the other hand, there can be some very real deadlines that cannot be renegotiated away, and in that situation, you use these other tactics to your best advantage. The seventh tactic that I've observed that's used a great deal is a deadlock. Now, a deadlock I consider to be the ultimate impasse. A deadlock is no agreement, and people walk away, and there is no agreement, they go elsewhere. Many people look at deadlock as a failure. It is not a failure. Deadlock is a useful tactic in negotiations, and sometimes it's very appropriate because perhaps the deal offered by the other side and you can't get them to budge is just so inappropriate that you really can do better elsewhere, or you'd rather not have it at all. It also is a test of the other side's resolve and strength. If you have analyzed a situation where you feel they are going to need you very badly, perhaps this is a way to get them to meet you a lot closer to where you want to be. If you're using it for that purpose, I suggest you give them a face-saving way of coming back. Think about deadlock, though. It's risky. You have to be safe within your own organization to use it. The reason people avoid it is that they're not certain that their own organization can accept a deadlock, and many organizations cannot. Because a bad settlement is often easier to justify than a deadlock. But if your organization is prepared for a deadlock, or is educated enough to understand deadlock as a tactic, then certainly use it to your advantage and be prepared the other side is going to be using it. And one final thing I want to say about deadlock, and that is a deadlock, as much as you think is the end of a negotiation, it can be broken by one small concession. So if you take the time and you work with the person and you explore all sorts of alternatives with them and hypotheticals, if you get them to budge on one small element, you've broken the deadlock and you're in a whole new ball game, and you might be able to eventually come to some agreement. So work on those deadlocks if you get them on the other side. Another technique I've seen to break a deadlock is by introducing new people, new negotiators into the situation. Because sometimes a deadlock may be due to a personality conflict, or the personalities are spent or exhausted in the situation. Perhaps some new people might be able to inject new attitudes.
Is another way of just getting away from that formal setting and perhaps just letting time itself may be the basis for breaking that deadlock?
That's a very good idea, too. I've seen that done as well. Certainly give the other side a face-saving way of coming back as well. You might break at a meeting and say, I think, rather than say we haven't made a deal, let's just think about it for a week and we'll get together at the same time and same place and see where we are. That's a very good way. I like that.
Allows some time for some lateral thinking, too.
That's right. Very good. Very good. Well, Ed, the 8th tactic I've seen is called reverse auctions. This is the dream tactic of a really tough buyer. It's what it is. It's a bidding war of salespeople. Say I'm in the market for some computer equipment. What I do is I phone up every single company that I feel would have suitable equipment for me, and I have them come out and educate my people as to what I need and what would be suitable and how their equipment works and how the competition's works and why theirs is better than the competition's. And then I get an offer from that particular supplier. Then I call up another company and I have them come out and do the same number. Not only do I become very educated on computer equipment, but I inform the second person of what my initial offer was and get them to cut lower. And then I go back to the first one or a third, and as a result I end up knowing more about computer equipment than any one of those salespeople, and I get an extremely advantageous deal. So advantageous, in fact, that I might have been able to talk one of those computer companies or salesmen into taking a negative deal. Now, a negative deal results because that particular salesperson has invested so much time or effort in working with you that they feel that they have to get something out of it, and at the very least they're going to keep your business and not give it to the competitor, or they're going to at least break even. But as a result, as a buyer, I've gotten an extremely good deal. Mm-hmm. Now, I think reverse auctions are useful for buyers, and I'm saying you should use it if you can, ethically and without violation of any laws. On the other hand, if you are on the other side of reverse auction, that is a much more difficult position, and I have some ideas on how to deal with that. First of all, you have to be very frank with the purchaser. You have to be very frank about your shortcomings as well as the advantageous points about your product. If you aren't frank about your shortcomings, you will not have credibility with the buyer, and the competition will surely bring it up anyway. So you may as well be frank. Sell your strengths and the benefits of your side of the deal. There must be some unique thing about your product or your service different from your competition, reasons why the buyer should accept you and not the others. Perhaps the equipment is the same, but perhaps you give better service, or you're known in the industry to have a longer life of product, or perhaps your research and development department at the home headquarters is more developed, and the newer models would be easier to accept and install. Certainly sell your strengths, and don't run into concessions when you've got a buyer like this. Time is certainly more on your side, and realize at the very beginning that this person needs you to supply them with the information. So spend that time giving them the information, and when they want a concession from you, see if you can get something in return, because perhaps they're using the big pot tactic on you. Perhaps they're fictional issues that they don't necessarily want, and it will necessarily strengthen your result for you and within your own organization if you can cut off some of your performance if the other side doesn't particularly want it. You understand what I mean?
Yes.
You can cut your costs and still come up with a deal that's advantageous to both sides. Bring experts when you've got a buyer who's doing this on you. The buyer certainly has to rely on somebody, and he's going to be hearing different stories from many different people, and the more credible the expert, the better. And when you analyze it from the very beginning, determine what your bottom line is and don't violate it. Because at a certain point you have to realize that you're not going to make a deal with this person that's to your benefit, and you may as well just leave. The 9th tactic that I've observed is really a group of tactics, but they're related. Their names are escalation, deliberate mistake, phony offer, and non-performance. Now, I think we all know what non-performance is. It's making an agreement and then one side not performing. I call it a tactic, but I tend to think it verges on unethical business practices. Phony offers are something somewhat less of non-performance, but similar in the sense that someone overtly makes an offer they know they do not intend to follow. A deliberate mistake is somewhat a little bit less than that. You've all heard of construction bidding, where someone makes an arithmetical error. Well, sometimes those errors are deliberate, and the purpose of those errors are to get the contract and then discover the error at a later time and renegotiate the price of the contract. Sometimes they're honest errors and they should be renegotiated, and sometimes they're deliberate. Escalation is a somewhat lesser grade of all these things. It's where you and I, say, are negotiating an employment contract, and you're going to work for me, and we agree that your salary is going to be $30,000 a year with certain benefits, and you would like more because of your experience and expertise, but you feel the opportunity is well. At this point, I say to you, fine, now you think you've made a deal with me, and I say, fine, I have to go approve this with Mr. So-and-so, who's the vice president of management. So we bring him into the picture, and all of a sudden, he's negotiating with you. He's negotiating down from 30 to 28. And when you think you've made a deal with the vice president of management, at 28, we bring in the chairman of the board, who negotiates you down to 25.
Yes.
That is escalation, also a practice used, and it may or may not be ethical, depending on the circumstances. But my purpose of bringing it up right now is that all four of these tactics are used, and we must be prepared to deal with them in the business context. Let me say first, the reason they work is that people, once they are confronted with a phony offer or deliberate mistake or a non-performance, they throw up their hands and they say, what can I do? I've got to take this guy the way he is. Just have to take it the way he's going to perform it now. Or I've got to take it renegotiated with this new element or with this new number that he's now found. Or I have to renegotiate it with the chairman of the board. I can't walk away. That's totally untrue. You can protest, and you should protest if people are using these tactics on you, because they aren't fair. They don't seem to be in good faith, depending on the circumstances, and it often may be a signal, if you resist it, that other side has gone too far, and they might respect you. So in other words, don't let them lower your aspiration level by using one of these tactics on you. You have to communicate that they've gone too far, and you can do so by either protesting, walking away with a deadlock, giving yourself perhaps an opportunity to get back, calling their bluff one way or another, but certainly being unwilling to go along with the deal with this new element, the surprise element. You can counter-escalate. You can change your offer or demand for rational or irrational reasons. Or perhaps if you feel that there is a possibility at the initial agreement stage that there will be a phony offer or non-performance, get security. Get a performance bond. Get collateral, whatever you feel will secure you from that other person breaking a deal. There's no reason that one should be caught this way if you anticipate it. And that's the reason for us to talk about these tactics right now. But again, the whole thread that I like to run through all my tactics is that a person must keep their aspiration level high. And if you keep considering where you want to go and that it is reasonable and justifiable for you to achieve that goal, then you will get there. You will get all that much higher to it. I've had one settlement of a lawsuit that comes to mind when I think about high aspiration level, where I was given authority to settle a lawsuit at $10,000 for a defendant, meaning they would pay up to $10,000, but not more. The plaintiff gives me an initial offer of $10,000. Well, I'm quite surprised. I thought he was going to ask for a lot more, and I was going to have to negotiate him down to $10,000. What do? Do I accept the $10,000? Certainly I could. It's within my authority, and and my client will probably be happy. No, I decide, I want to keep my aspiration level very high. I want to get a better deal for my client if I can, something that will be acceptable to both sides, nevertheless. So I rethink, using some of my lateral thinking techniques, how can I justify a lower level than 10,000? Well, to make a long story short, after some talking, using time, perhaps some fictional issues, I got him down to 9,000. Now, let me tell you, my client was extremely happy. That was $1,000 that they had saved, the way they looked at it.
Which of these tactics did you use in negotiating that settlement?
I know I used time, because when someone is going to get money, they want it now. And since I'm holding the money and I have the use of it, time is on my side. I know that there were fictional issues, namely the other parties in the lawsuit that we were discussing, and perhaps the need to further litigate and some upcoming time-consuming projects that we were litigating. So these sorts of things were all playing upon him, in addition to just his general workload. If I know he's very, very busy and he wants to settle the lawsuit, that is another tactic. The more I know about the other side, the better. So I'd say that I used all the tactics that came to mind that seemed to apply at the time, and I ended up getting a very advantageous deal with a high aspiration level.
Our next interview is with Mr. Summers White, president of his own consulting firm in Phoenix, Arizona, which specializes in assisting organizations in securing financing. Prior to starting his own firm, Summers' career was in banking, and at one time held the title of youngest bank president in America. He is also an AMR faculty member in its How to Negotiate for Money seminar. In the interview, Summers gives us the important steps in how to negotiate a bank loan, including preparation, strategies, and tactics, and also how to develop credibility with the loan officer, a critical element in negotiating for money. Okay, Summers, how do you prepare for negotiating a loan from a bank?
By allowing a lot of time, because it usually takes more time than you think it will.
Why is that so?
Well, it's like anything else. 90% of how you will do is usually determined before you ever get in front of the person. And so with a banker, you need preparation. Preparation is the key.
What types of things would go into that preparation?
Well, the first thing is that you do a careful analysis. You'd look internally at yourself, your organization. You'd look externally in terms of those factors that are affecting the bank at the particular time. Is it an easy money time? Is it a tight money time? Has the bank had a lot of problems? Have they had a change in management? In your analysis, you ask yourself, if I were in the loan officer's position, why would I turn down this loan? And you want to make sure that you analyze all those negatives so that you're prepared ahead of time. You want to brainstorm, you want to rehearse it, you want to role play. Amateur night is over when you go to the bank. You want to look ahead as to what the future may hold for you and the bank. In other words, you want to take a very broad perspective, and then you want to take a very narrow perspective. You want to understand your company and understand the bank in your preparation.
In dealing with the loan officer, I would imagine understanding that loan officer's position is a very crucial part in negotiating for a loan. Is that true?
Yes, because you've got to know where he's coming from. First of all, the loan officer is not compensated for taking good-sized risks. The risk-reward ratio is very low, and that's the way it should be, because he's dealing with other people's money. You've got to look at the ability of that loan officer. Some loan officers are very capable, some are not. Some are very good salesmen, some are not good salesmen. So you have to look at his situation. If he has come out of the computer department and is now sitting at the loan desk, well, it may be great if you're trying to get a loan for a computer company, but he may not feel comfortable if he's new on the job or if he's ready to retire. So you got to look at what is his situation, because the situation for every loan officer will be a little bit different in terms of their experience, in terms of how long they've been with the organization, in terms of if they have a new president of the organization, if the organization has gone through some problems, maybe he's begun to feel some heat put on him. So you've got to look at his particular situation. That loan officer that you dealt with 2 years ago may not be the same loan officer today. He may not be the same loan officer in another bank that he was in the old bank.
Summers, how do you develop credibility with the loan officer?
You want to be believable to the loan officer, and there are a number of different things that you can do, no one of which is so important, but the cumulative effect of them can be very important. The first thing you do is you come in with preparation, and that preparation should be in writing. And you answer the loan officer's questions before perhaps he asks them. You have thought out what he needs to know. You may not have everything, but if you come in and you've got 4 or 5 of the things that he needs to know, and maybe needs to know 6 or 7 things, it's pretty impressive. You develop credibility by always meeting your commitments. So you don't get yourself on the overdraft list. You don't get yourself on the list of past due loans, even if it's for 1 day. Because that list goes up to the board of directors by law in every bank, both those lists, the overdraft lists and the past due loans. So if you've got a big check coming in from a large organization and it's going to be a day late so that you can't pay your loan, tell the loan officer, I want to make a 1-day loan. He says, oh, you don't need to, and so on. Tell him, no, I want to make a 1-day loan. And he gets the feeling like you are the person who really wants to meet his commitments. The other thing is, if you have a problem, loan officers can take a problem, but you have to tell them when you know it. In other words, don't let him find out something in a loan committee, whether it's good news or bad news, from anybody except you. It needs to come from you and not somebody else. Don't let him have egg on his face. If they say, hey, Ed, did you hear about the XYZ company, and you don't know anything about it, then you look bad. So that's a way of developing credibility with him. The other thing is that if somebody is talking about, boy, do I have a hangover today. How do you feel about that guy? Is that the guy that you want to make the loan to? He says, I was out the racetrack and I won a lot of money, or I dropped a lot of money, or I was in Las Vegas. Is that the kind of person? Or he says, look at the legs on that. He better be talking about the piano, because we find that those people who drink, gamble, chase, and so on don't exactly have the same record for paying off. Or somebody who takes advantage of other people, he tries to get shortcuts. So you don't ever want to indicate that you took an advantage of anybody, man, woman, child, dog, whoever it may be. You may have been taken advantage of, not because you were dumb, but because you had integrity.
In developing a strategy, what are some methods or factors that should be considered in developing a strategy for negotiating a loan?
Well, you can look at it in a long-run standpoint, and you can look at it in a short-run standpoint. It's like this, Ed. Maybe we might say, how often do you change lawyers? How often do you change doctors? How often do you change accountants? And so your relationship with a bank is like it is with a professional person. You want to watch out that you don't keep running over to one place, running over to another. It's a special kind of relationship. And this is hard for some people to recognize. Maybe they talk about interest rates. And I say something like this, well, look, for a fee of $1,500, I'll be able to cut your interest rate 2 points, guaranteed, and you don't have to pay me the fee until I perform, and I'll be able to cut it for 2 years. Well, that's a fantastic deal for any businessman. But then I add, there's one little catch, and that is in the 3rd year you won't be able to borrow any money. No businessman ordinarily wants to have that kind of deal. And so you have to say, are you in it from a long run or short run standpoint? In other words, what's your strategy? So you don't want to win the war, as the old saying goes, and lose the peace. So you're not just in it for a short run. You have to realize that in terms of your strategy, you can bring pressure to bear on a banker by shopping other banks for rate or something else, but maybe that will irritate him in certain ways. In terms of your strategy, you want to look at what's the competitive situation in the market. Is it an easy time or a bad time? What's your fallback position? You know, all the great generals of history had problems. They may have had their cavalry overrun, or something happened to their artillery, or their troops were slaughtered, their infantrymen. But each of those generals had a fallback position determined. And he had some troops in reserve that he sent in with the when the problem got there, and if something happened to those people, then he had his fallback position of what he was going to do. So with your strategy, you ought to know what you're going to do as you fall back if something happens.
What would be an example in negotiating for a loan? What would be some types of fallback positions that you might consider?
What are you going to do if he tells you no? In other words, if he tells you you can't have $1.5 million, are you going to say, well, I'll settle for $1 million? If he tells you that the interest rate is going to be a certain level, before you go in, you ought to think about what the interest rate will be. How high are you willing to pay? What are you willing to do?
So you have to know your bottom line then.
Yeah, you have to know exactly what it is, and there may be a number of things that you want. You can't get everything. Do you want to get off the continuing personal guarantee for some entrepreneur that's listening to us? Do you want to go from a secured to an unsecured basis? Do you want to have the terms eased? Or do you want to borrow for a longer length of time? Do you want to cut down the compensating balances? Do you want to get more money? Do you want to cut the interest rate? So, yeah, you want to do all these things, but the idea is that you ought to have your priorities in order for you. So maybe getting off the personal guarantee is or isn't important, so you ought to be able to jockey things. As the saying goes, every deal is negotiable. So we've talked a little bit about, how to handle bad news, and we've talked about how you decide the importance of each issue to you. And in a sense, maybe what we say is we anticipate the needs, our own needs and the lender's needs. We watch out for making dumb mistakes a second time. Don't keep repeating those mistakes. And
what are some examples of some
dumb mistakes?
Dumb mistakes?
Well, one of the things you have to realize that it's not illogical, it's emotional. And so one of the things that I suggest is that you send your lender a Christmas present. Maybe it's just a little book. Maybe it's a, something that's appropriate, such as in Washington they say a small ham and you'll stay out of trouble. So it could be on the front page of the newspaper. Let me give you an example. One banker said to me, I got a bottle of whiskey for Christmas, and I was very appreciative of that customer. He said, somebody else sent me a case, and I sent it back, and I was mad. Now, in a particular case, so here's a dumb mistake coming up. What happened was that the borrower sent his loan officer a bottle of whiskey each year, but he didn't realize that his loan officer was a Mormon. And of course, a good Mormon is not going to have whiskey. That's a dumb mistake. But suppose that you learned that he was a Mormon and then you sent the whiskey. That's a really dumb mistake. The following year, that is. Okay, that's an example. Be alert and find out what you're doing. In certain countries, different flowers mean different things. And today, with the international situation, there are flowers that are only appropriate for death in certain countries. Mm. So don't let him think of you as the death loan.
Before you mentioned, Summers, the developing of credibility with the loan officer and how they would react negatively to any attempts by you to manipulate them. What are some common dumb mistakes that people quite often make in trying to manipulate a loan officer?
Well, they tell about something that they can't possibly achieve so that he doesn't believe them. They have something about some achievement that isn't there, or they overstate something. So what happens is that they're not believed. I'll give you an example of my own experience. I came to be a bank president in a new city, and an important executive had an office across the street from us. And as a matter of fact, he controlled the whole block of this organization that was across the street. And he also had a home in the other city I was coming from. And one of our directors said to me, have you met this man, or do you know him? And I said, well, I've met him. Now, he asked, I think it was, do you know him? I said, I've met him. Well, the next day he saw this important businessman who headed this organization. He said, I understand you met Summers White. He said, met him? He said, he was over at my house in the other city last Sunday playing tennis. He said, met him? Hell, he's a good friend of mine. Ever after that, that director always put great weight on what I said. And I did it by understatement rather than overstatements. And so I'd say, watch out for the superlatives that you use with a banker. try not to use superlatives. It destroys your credibility. And instead of building you up, it pulls you down.
All right, but let's take a look at the other side of that, too. They're often quite hesitant or concerned about making a good loan. How do you go about convincing a loan officer of your credibility, of the fact that you do have the basis for that loan?
Well, the first thing, let me state that I often get a little nervous when I'm in the bank and I'm making a deposit at the bank with a male teller, with a man teller that has his hat on, particularly if he's reading travel folders about Brazil. So by the same token, timing is extremely important with the lender. And if you come in and say, I got the money, I got to understand the payroll. Well, that doesn't do it. It's a building process. You know, the Chinese have lots of expressions about how you can build a friend over many years, but you can lose them with a very short comment. And so it isn't something that's done overnight. It's you create confidence in a lot of little ways, not with one big thing.
Mm-hmm. Once you're in the negotiating process with the loan officer, what specific types of tactics have you found useful in conducting that negotiations?
Well, there are a lot of styles you can have, such as being manipulative, aggressive, assertive, persistent, criticizing, compromising, problem-solving, no nonsense. I think the most important thing in terms of your tactics is to be consistent, to keep them informed. If you kept them informed in the past, then they think you're going to keep them informed in the future. Don't make promises that you can't use or can't keep up to, rather. There are all kinds of tactics that you can use. Here's an example. A friend of mine had a banker who was really pressing him. He had about 150 employees in an electronics plant. And he just pulled the keys of the plant out of his pocket and he handed them over to the banker. He said, here they are, they're yours. He said, what do you mean? He said, these are yours. He said, what are those? He said, they're the keys to the plant. He said, I'm not going back. You now own it, lock, stock, and barrel. And the banker said, hey, wait a minute. No, just take it easy. So you have to decide the point beyond which you won't be pressed. He had his fallback position determined. He had his tactics that he was ready to use at that time. So that was a risk, okay? And you have to know what risks you are willing to take, and you're willing to, stay with the thing. If you say you're going to do something, you're going to leave or whatever it may be, then you better be ready to live up. But don't say you're going to do something and then back off. You can have, communications breakdowns. One of the things that you have to do in terms of your tactics is recognize when you're in there with the person, what are the motivators? And there are 4 motivators, and those are pride, imitation, fear, and gain. And so what is it that's going to make this particular loan officer be triggered? Tactic is to say, we want to have a caucus. I was with some clients' insurance company recently. And so we just said, could we step in the other room for a moment? And so we just went in and said, hey, is there anything else we haven't brought up, and what do you want to go through? A lot of people are not used to caucusing with their lenders. They might be in labor negotiations. The tactic is after the meeting, or after you get the loan. We're brought up on fairy stories, and that is that the guy and gal got married and they lived happily ever after. Well, anybody who's married knows that's just the start. That's not the beginning. And so it's not when you get the loan that you're ended. It's just that you're starting with them at that time. You want to recognize the importance of the initial meeting with them, in other words, the initial few minutes, and then the time when you leave, because it's the first impression. You never get a second chance of the first impression. And he wants to grasp the overall picture. Too many times people get them down in details rather than giving them the big picture and giving it to them very quickly, and then recognizing that when they leave, that what happens is that that's what the loan officer is going to remember the most. So the start and the finish. And maybe I could put it in a different way. I don't know if you're a chess player, Ed, but if you are, there's the opening game in the chess game, which is very short, but it sets everything up. There's the middle game, which is the long time, and then there's the close, and the end game. And that's key with you, because that's the last thing, and that's where it's really determined.
In those initial 4 minutes, what are some things that a loan officer might look for?
He wants to know, how much do you want to borrow? How long do you want to borrow it for? What are you going to do with the money? How are you going to pay it back? And how are you going to pay it back if something goes wrong?
And those are the points that you should try to cover in those initial
That's
few
right.
minutes. And after the meeting, those 90 seconds after the meeting,
Well, you want to recognize what you're leaving with him, because you may have been talking for a couple hours and you have to have a summary. And do you draw it all together and have it bang, bang, bang for him?
you mentioned the 4 motivators. Could you give us some examples of how those are used by a person negotiating with the loan officer?
Well, they're pride, imitation, fear, and gain. Fear would have been the keys handing across, that they're afraid you're going to do it. Gain is it's going to be a very profitable loan. You show them how it's going to lead to other business, something like that. Imitation might be that some other bank is willing to do it. Pride might be that he'll be able to go on your board, or he might be able to do certain other things. In other words, that it makes him feel big, or that he'll have to maybe meet with some other people that he would enjoy meeting with, so it gives him stature, that kind of thing. So it gives him standing. So and these motivators are true in any type of convincing or negotiating.
What are some long-run things you do to develop that kind of confidence and credibility after you've negotiated the loan with your banker or the loan officer?
Well, I'd put it a different way. I'll put it the opposite. What do you not do? Okay? You don't take the money and then jump up and say, "Whoopee, we got the money!" and call the office from his desk. Say, "Can I use the phone?" and say, "Send out the checks, it's okay." And you do what you say you're going to do. In other words, you don't make a loan to your brother-in-law or buy your brother-in-law's business out. You don't send your financial statements when they're really old. There's something in your paper, in the newspaper, about you had a fire. You call them up and you tell them. But when your profits are down and your balance sheet is deteriorating and you got a whole other set of problems, you don't tell them, "Hey, business is great." It's just follow through, and follow through is hard to do, because what happens is after passion passes, you still have to follow through. And so the passion, in this case, revolves around getting the money. And when it's over, a lot of people say, "I got the money, I don't have to do anything." Well, the point is they're going to need something down the line some other time. This is true. We've been talking about banks, but it's true for insurance companies. That I had some people who didn't do their follow-through. 8 years later, after they got the loan, they wanted to do some things with the building, and they needed the support or permission of the insurance company. But what happened was they had alienated them so much 8 years ago, and it was in the file, that they couldn't get what they wanted now. So it's follow-through afterwards.